always a classic joke. They said the old squirrel that used to get in the church, and they said he got into the Baptist church one Sunday, and they said, well, what did the Baptists do? They said, oh, well, they went and got a cage and caught the squirrel and took it way down to the park, nice park, and let it back out. And then they had another squirrel that got into the Catholic church, and they said, well, what did you do? And they said, oh, we fed it. We put a little corn and peanuts outside for the squirrel to distract it during church so we wouldn't be back in the church. And they asked the Methodist preacher what he did to it. He said, oh, we made him a member and hadn't seen him since. Just baptized Charlie. He was making an escape. Oh, that felt good. I told Dan and Lauren this week I was going to have to go to the gym and do push-ups so I could pick up Charlie. I didn't do enough push-ups, and I should have been on the treadmill more. I'm still out of breath. But that was awesome, to be able to welcome a new member of faith and to ask God's blessing upon him and to reveal God's grace to him. That's the sacraments. They're the outward signs of this invisible grace happening in our lives. It's nothing that we as the church do. It's nothing that we as preachers do. It's fully God's action in place. It's always God's promise. God is always faithful to the very end, and that is without end. God is always remains faithful to us, and it's God's promise to accept us and to love us and to claim us as God's very own. And so we do that, and we claim that through the waters of baptism. I thought about, as I got the water out of the faucet this morning, that's just plain old city of Greensboro water through 100-year-old pipes and a 100-year-old building. And that water is nothing special more than what we get out of our faucet to drink. But it's God's blessing, and when we pray over that water, we bless that water, that it becomes God's work in God's way, to be able to impart God's Spirit, to counsel the power of sin in our lives, to allow us to be able to live into God's kingdom and to be God's people, to be able to experience the fullness of God. That's offered to us all without price. And we do that through the waters of baptism. And when we do that, I was glad that you were here this morning and watching online, that when we join together in that, we also reaffirm our baptismal covenant, that we also reclaim that for us. God's always faithful. God is always remaining. God is always there. But sometimes we get a little askew. And we need to hear ourselves say that to remind us of the goodness of God and God's presence. This text is really kind of interesting in this light of the baptism and to be able to, in these days, this is a beginning in chapter 4 in Mark. We heard from chapter 3 last week. Jesus had called the disciples and began to teach. And in chapter 4, it is the whole gospel of parables. Jesus begins to present and teach. We think of Mark as the earliest gospel written, that first written record of Jesus' teaching. And so we hear these passages as some of the very first parables that Jesus offered. Jesus says about the seed and the growing of the flower, that the day goes by and the night goes by and the flower emerges and it begins to grow, and the farmer, the person who plants it, doesn't know really how it works. Oftentimes I get impatient, especially in the spring. I want to see what my roses are going to do this year. I want to see what the daisies are going to look like. I want to see what's going to happen. But I know that if I take that plant and cut it off and begin to pull apart the pieces of that bloom, that it's going to just go south really quickly. All kinds of discolored leaves, and it'll fall apart and come apart. I can't do anything about that. I might be a gardener, but I'm not the master gardener. I'm not the one who actually causes it to happen. The nature of the way of nature grows, and it begins to put forth these beautiful flowers. I love the spring flowers. Those roses, sometimes they feel like they're as big as your head or palm of your hand. They just keep getting bigger and bigger. And yet they're nurtured and sustained and be able to have made it through that harsh winter, and they reemerge. But I can't do anything. I can only kind of sort of tend it. I can only sort of bring some water to it or try to keep some of the water away recently. God begins this growth and it continues in and through. Our life lived in the life of faith is that. It's this experience of God's grace and this transformation of God to bring about change in our lives and in our world. Part of what we hear once again is the message of hope in the gospel. That those things that we put in the ground, those little seeds that we cover with dirt, that they begin to sprout and blossom and bloom to do what they're supposed to do. Human creation might do better if we would listen just a little bit more to the ways of the gospel, to be able to vote with our hearts and minds and to be able to encourage others on our way using this ways of faith and this lens of faith in our world. This is one of those passages that is kind of marked elsewhere, but it's only through Mark's understanding and through Mark's lens that we have it presented as it is today. This parable of the mustard seed is one of those that perhaps, if those of us who've grown up in churches for years, maybe have made one. I remember it. I still have it, but I think it's at Mom and Dad's, squirreled away in some drawer. It's a little button with a little mustard seed on it, glued to it, on a piece of orange paper. And it reminds us of the smallest of seeds becomes a great tree. And usually by this point of the year, we would be worried about the heat and the exhaustion. And so this whole idea of a tree that can create shade might be relevant to us. If you've seen those conversations, we had a conversation out in the parking lot the other day, and it went on for a little while. And they said, why don't we move into the shade? The sun was hot, and it was getting a little bit humid. So we moved in the shade, and the difference that living and staying in that shade made is astronomical. But also walking, sometimes the dog will get caught out on the lower side when it starts to rain. Those clouds, they come up in such weird ways. I'm not expecting it to show up. And we've been on a kind of a long walk, and we're headed back toward the house. And along the park section where I live, there's a string of trees. Now, don't do this in a lightning storm, but in a rainstorm, this is okay. That when it starts to rain and it gets to really kind of putting down pretty heavy, we'll make it for those trees and begin to walk back toward the house under the branches of those trees. It's amazing what kind of water the trees shed from you to live in the shade of the tree. That tree kind of offers up protection and some break from the hot and also from the wet. It offers a nurturing and sustaining. I don't know, something about it in the midst of the storm when you're there, it feels kind of like you're protected just a little bit. You're not quite facing everything on your own. To live in the shade of the trees. But these mustard trees, Jesus says that the birds can rest in its branches and in the shade. It offers life and a place to be able to nurture and sustain the nest of the eggs, the little birds that are coming forth. It offers that up as a place of life and of hope. Perhaps that's where the church is. It's a place to offer up hope and life. It's a place to empower us to go forth into the world, to face the storms all around us in so many different ways. There are all kinds of storms that we might face in our lives. And yet we know that in the shade of Christ and God's grace that there's a difference. There's strength, there's power, there's perseverance, there's an ongoing. And the gift of God's grace that active in our lives begins a transformation. That we truly can become who God has created us to be. That we've been empowered by God's grace to offer up to the world. I look around this room and I hate to tell you, but there ain't no two of you look alike. You're all different. You're all unique. You're all part of God's handiwork. Creation that only God could bring together in a way that is a transformative power. Oh, the beauty of all of God's creation is amazing. I sometimes go back and read the story, the accounts from Genesis about creation. And I love that day in, day one, day two, day three. You know, the scholars say that passage was designed to be used in church as part of worship. It was a pattern. I always think it was so amazing that the pattern and the method is right there in line with what the scientists say of time, or how the scientists say evolution occurred. It's the same pattern that we read. I just think that's amazing. When God and the world comes together and how we can understand and see that in a different light. But the very idea of every day that God created, at the end of the day, God looked around and said it was, you probably know that, say it, good. All of creation, all 6 days of creation, everything was good. Well, somehow bad got in the mix. Oh, that's for another story, another sermon or dissertation or whatever you want to call it. But it was labeled good, and we're labeled good. God's grace working in and through us makes a difference in our lives and in the world around us. Part of what I think is so important to be people of faith in today's world is to be a countercultural understanding that the world is good, that God is present, and that we will continue to work for God's kingdom. That through our efforts, through our energy, through our care, through our nurture, that God's kingdom will continue to grow in the world. I know, you see the same news I do. Sometimes there are days I just wish they would be quiet. Let me live in my own little happy utopium. And yet, at the same time, we have to tell ourselves, we have to remember, we have to reflect, we have to live in God's history. And we have to live in God's assertion or the certainty of God's future. To never give up hope. To always know that God continues to nurture and sustain us. To know that our baptism and Charlie's baptism begins to work within us. That we become God's people. It doesn't matter if you're just a wee little tyke of a few months old, 1 year, 12 months old. Or if you've been around for, 100 and some. Don't forget that God's transformation and God's grace and God's faithfulness is still at work in our lives and in our world. And that we are to be ambassadors for the faith. We are to share our light with all the world. We're to offer up the goodness that we have received to others. And we're to see with God's eyes the world around us. Oh, glory, honor, and power be to the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen.